They used to call it a sanctuary of learning, rows of young minds seated behind polished desks, reciting facts like a practiced choir. But what if this grand ritual was never about freedom? What if, from the moment we stepped through those doors, we entered a carefully constructed experiment designed to shape us? Picture the hush that falls when a teacher lifts her hand, the collective inhale before the first question is asked. Feel the tension behind the shuffle of test papers in examination halls, each tick of the clock marking another moment of silent compliance. Think back to the applause that swells at graduation ceremonies, a thunderous celebration of achievement. But achievement in what exactly? Memorizing dates? Mastering formulas? Obeying instructions? Beneath these familiar comforts lies something far more disquieting, a blueprint for control. From ancient academies that hoarded knowledge behind ivy-clad walls to medieval schools that trained clerks for the service of kings, education has often served the powerful. Those early scholars didn't teach curiosity, they taught obedience. And today's institutions, with their bells, timetables, and standardized exams, carry that legacy forward. Why do we chase grades as if they define our worth? Why do we parade from class to class, raising our hands only when called upon? These rituals prime our minds to follow rather than to question, to accept rather than to challenge. Every lesson learned is another brick in the wall that separates us from independent thought. Now imagine stepping beyond those halls and recognizing the true battleground, your own mind. The architects of this system, the unseen hands behind curricula and bell schedules, wield conformity as their weapon. Their aim? A populace that thinks within prescribed lines, that moves in unison, that doesn't stray. Today, we begin to unravel their strategy. We will expose the methodology behind each lesson, each test, each reward, and show how the classroom has become a testing ground for compliance. The question isn't just what they taught you, but why, and more importantly, how you can break free. They say power wears many faces. In the early 16th century, Niccolò Machiavelli laid bare the mechanics of authority in his landmark works, The Prince and the Discourses. He didn't romanticize rulers as paragons of virtue, he portrayed them as architects of influence, masters of manipulation. Here, in the dimly lit halls of a Florentine court, whisper networks thrived, counselors leaning close, offering counsel shaped by ambition, not altruism. Citizens watched in awe and fear, never certain whether their next favor or punishment awaited. Machiavelli observed that true power depends on two things above all: the obedience of subjects and the ignorance of their minds. A ruler who tolerates too much questioning risks mutiny. One who tolerates too little risks stagnation and resentment. So he recommended a careful balance. Dangle opportunity, then reinforce loyalty. Allow dissent just enough to appear free, then draw the leash tighter. This ruthless calculus feels uncannily familiar when we step into a modern classroom. Think back. Every silent acknowledgement of the teacher's authority, every correct recitation, reinforced the idea that knowledge and power flow from those at the front. Machiavelli would nod knowingly at our standardized lessons, rewards for compliance, penalties for divergence. The same principles he applied to princes and republics were baked into the very idea of schooling. Consider this. In The Prince, Machiavelli insists that appearances matter more than reality. It's better for a ruler to seem merciful than to be merciful, because perception shapes belief. In the classroom, too, the facade of open inquiry can mask a strict hierarchy. We learn the language of debate, discuss, analyze, critique, yet step out of line, and we face lowered grades, social rebuke, or silence. We're trained to believe we're agents of our own education, even as the structure channels us into narrow tracks. Machiavelli celebrated adaptability. A prince must be like the fox, cunning enough to spot traps, and like the lion, strong enough to scare away wolves. But schools rarely teach us to shift strategy. They teach us to follow the prescribed path. Curiosity becomes a liability when it unsettles the smooth operation of the institution. As we peel back these layers, Machiavelli's classroom emerges not as a relic of history, but as the blueprint for modern influence. His lessons on power dynamics live on in every syllabus, every lecture, every exam. To understand how they shape us, we must see school not as a benevolent guide, but as a Machiavellian arena, a training ground for obedience where the greatest lesson taught is the art of being controlled. They say walls can speak if you know how to listen. Step into any modern school building and you'll hear their language loud and clear, the chime of bells, the hum of fluorescent lights, the shuffle of shoes down endless corridors. This is more than architecture. It's a meticulously designed system that molds behavior before a single lesson begins. Consider the origins. In 19th century Prussia, rulers faced a dilemma: how to produce disciplined workers and obedient soldiers on a mass scale. Their solution was the regimented schoolhouse, rigid schedules, uniform classrooms, teachers marching students through lessons as if they were drills. Fast forward to today, we still file into rooms in neat rows, our eyes trained on a single focal point at the front. The bell rings and we rise as one. It rings again and we sit. No questions asked. Why rows of desks instead of clusters? Because straight lines encourage straight thinking. They channel attention forward, limit peer collaboration, and minimize distractions. Why tune the lights to an uncomfortable glare? To sap energy, keeping minds focused on the task at hand rather than wandering to creative flights. Why walls stripped of color, save for mandatory bulletin boards? To reduce sensory stimuli that might spark independent thought. Every detail, dimensions of hallways, placement of restrooms, height of lockers, reinforces the same lesson: conformity. We move from class to class under the watchful eye of corridor cameras, subject to timestamps punched into plastic cards. These tokens of presence silently tally compliance. Arrived on time, sat in your seat, followed instructions. Miss a punch and you face detention. Miss too many and you're branded a problem. From an early age, we learn that deviation has a cost. Even the timetable is a psychological lever. Segments of 60 minutes for math, 45 for history, 30 for lunch. Each slot primes us to operate within prescribed intervals. We become creatures of the clock, conditioned to value punctuality over passion, efficiency over exploration. Yet this blueprint of control extends beyond walls and schedules. The very language of schooling, curriculum, syllabus, grading, speaks in bureaucratic code. It transforms learning into a checklist of objectives, measurable outcomes, and standardized assessments. Creativity is a footnote. Compliance is the headline. As we trace these blueprints, a pattern emerges. Schooling was never simply about knowledge. It was born from a desire to shape citizens, obedient, predictable, interchangeable. And though the uniforms and schedules have evolved, the underlying architecture remains. Each school building stands as a monument to conformity, its corridors echoing with the footsteps of students conditioned to fit the mold. Now imagine dismantling this structure from within. What if desks faced inward, lights softened to invite curiosity, timetables stretched to let ideas breathe? The walls would no longer confine thought, they would cradle it. But first, we must recognize the hidden design around us. Only then can we redraw the blueprints for a truly liberating education. Invisible signals pulse through every lesson plan, every slide, every graded paper. In the halls of modern education, the curriculum itself is a hidden machine, an engine that conditions your mind long before you realize it. At first glance, a math test or history lecture seems harmless enough. But beneath the surface lies a carefully calibrated set of psychological levers, each designed to prime you for obedience, not independence. Consider the power of reward and punishment. From your earliest school years, you learn to associate gold stars and A's with approval and self-worth, while red marks and low grades bring shame and self-doubt. Psychologists call this operant conditioning. Behavior followed by positive reinforcement tends to repeat, while behavior followed by negative consequences fades away. In practice, this means you're taught to chase grades over genuine curiosity, compliance over creativity. You memorize facts because doing so brings praise. You avoid creative leaps because failure carries too high a cost. Classical conditioning plays its role too. Think back to the tense hush before a pop quiz or the knot in your stomach when the bell rings for test time. Over years of school, your brain links the scent of cafeteria food, the glare of fluorescent lights, the echo of footsteps down a corridor with stress and performance anxiety. Today, even a pencil snapping in a quiet room can send your heart racing. This subconscious wiring primes you to respond reflexively to authority cues, raising your hand, sitting still, keeping your head down. Social proof, another subtle but potent lever, operates through the invisible currents of peer behavior. When every student in the room follows the rules, breaking. Ranks feels not only risky, but lonely. We watch classmates line up, raise their hands, nod in agreement. We internalize the message: to belong, obey. This herd mentality dynamic stifles dissent and labels the curious as troublemakers. One or two brave voices questioning the lesson plan quickly get drowned out by the sea of conformity. Interviews with educational psychologists reveal how testing anxiety and peer pressure intertwine to create a generation that equates learning with survival. Students become risk-averse, explains Dr. Layla Ahmed, a cognitive psychologist. They avoid open-ended tasks because the environment punishes failure more harshly than it rewards exploration. The result is a populace conditioned to pick the safe answer on multiple-choice tests and in life. Let's zoom in on a single classroom moment. A student, hands trembling, turns in a quiz with half-completed answers. Their mind races. What will the teacher think? Will their parents be disappointed? That fear doesn't belong to one child alone. It cascades through entire grade levels. We become experts at self-censorship. We learn to anticipate authorities' questions and prepare only the correct responses. Over time, the instinct to question is smothered by the reflex to conform. These personal stories echo a broader cultural effect. Societies filled with individuals who hesitate to challenge the status quo. When citizens have been primed to see authority as infallible, they're less likely to demand transparency from leaders or innovate in ways that disrupt comfortable patterns. The classroom thus becomes a microcosm of power structures at large. Schools teaching obedience, governments reinforcing obedience, corporations capitalizing on obedience. Perhaps the most insidious lever is the belief that intelligence equals obedience. When success metrics revolve around test scores and diplomas, the brightest minds learn early that brilliance without conformity is rewarded with silence. Creativity is tolerated only if it fits within predefined guidelines. Innovation, when it threatens established hierarchies, is branded reckless. As we unwrap these psychological mechanisms, the challenge becomes clear. To reclaim our minds, we must unlearn these conditioned responses. We must recognize the rewards we've chased, the fears we've internalized, and the herd behaviors we've copied. Only then can true curiosity, unbounded by the levers of compliance, begin to flourish. In the next section, we'll trace how these lessons extend far beyond classroom walls into the media you consume every day, turning you from a student into a spectator of your own life. Invisible threads stretch from the chalkboard to your living room screen, binding the lessons of the classroom to the rhythms of daily life. Just as bells rang to summon you to math, news jingles summon you to the latest headline, each designed to steer your attention, your beliefs, your very emotions. In this section, we peel back the veil on media's hidden curriculum and reveal how the same levers that primed you for obedience in school keep you in line long after graduation. Remember the structure of a lesson plan: introduction, explanation, reinforcement, assessment. Now tune your mind to the structure of a news broadcast. At the top, a dramatic teaser, then a carefully staged narrative, punctuated by expert interviews, closed with a summary that leaves no doubt what you're meant to feel. This isn't coincidence. It's curriculum repackaged. Bandwagon effects flood the screen. Stories of mass protests framed as chaotic mobs, polls presented to imply everyone thinks this way. Viewers invited to join the majority rather than question it. Authority bias appears in every talking head, network anchors posing as impartial observers, experts whose credentials are paraded to demand your trust. Just as you learn to trust the teacher at the front, your mind learns to trust the person seated behind the news desk. Propaganda techniques honed in wartime find new life in 24/7 news cycles. Scapegoating frames social issues in black and white, echoing the right answers and wrong answers drilled into you by standardized tests. Repetition cements narratives. Play the same clip of a politician's speech, add a few choice sound bites, and the story, no matter how thin, becomes gospel through sheer frequency. You respond reflexively, like a student conditioned to memorize definitions rather than explore their meaning. Social media platforms amplify these effects through algorithms that reward engagement over nuance. Just as teachers graded you on rote completion, platforms grade you on clicks and shares, pushing you toward content that reinforces your existing beliefs. Dissenting voices disappear into echo chambers, where any challenge to groupthink is drowned out by the collective roar. Peer pressure, once confined to classroom walls, now spans the globe. One viral post can enforce conformity faster than detention ever could. Corporate sponsorship and advertising insert lessons of consumerism between headlines. Products flash across the screen during commercial breaks, promising happiness in exchange for obedience. To brand messages, to cultural norms, to the idea that you must consume to belong. In school, you learn to behave for rewards. In media, you learn to buy for belonging. But the most insidious lesson is subtle, that reality itself is a lesson to be delivered, not a mystery to be explored. Graphics simplify complex issues into bullet points. Sound bites replace context. Your role shifts from active participant to passive recipient. You absorb the curriculum of the screen while the true authors of your consent, the media moguls, the algorithm architects, the advertisers, stay hidden off camera. These parallels are no accident. The same architects who shaped your early education now shape your worldview, wielding cameras and code as deftly as teachers once wielded chalk. And just as you learn to question why you raised your hand in class, you must now question why you click, why you watch, why you believe. In the next section, we'll pivot from critique to possibility, following the stories of those who refused to be passive recipients, individuals and movements that reclaimed the narrative and, in doing so, cracked the code of compliance. Their journeys illuminate how knowledge itself can become our weapon against manipulation, whether forged at the blackboard or broadcast to millions. They say the cage is invisible until you learn to see the bars. Across centuries, bold thinkers and educators have dared to pry open the classroom door and invite students inside, not to follow a script, but to write their own. In these stories of intellectual rebellion, we find the blueprint for unshackling the mind. Take Maria Montessori, who at the turn of the 20th century upended the notion that children learn by passive absorption. She watched as small hands rearranged beads and curious eyes traced letters in sand. Rather than punishing wrong answers, she celebrated each spark of inquiry. Her classrooms became laboratories of discovery, where children charted their own course. Montessori taught that when you trust a learner's innate passion, obedience to a syllabus gives way to devotion to knowledge. Fast forward to Paulo Freire in 1960s Brazil. He called traditional schooling the banking model, where students are empty vaults and teachers the depositors. Freire partnered with impoverished communities, transforming literacy classes into dialogues of liberation. Students learn to read words and the world, recognizing the power structures that shape their lives. In that exchange, the oppressed became critical subjects. no longer objects of instruction, but architects of their own understanding. Closer to home, modern unschooling pioneers reject rigid curricula altogether. Families turn dining tables into think tanks and backyards into history's living stages. Without grades, children roam the landscape of ideas, following threads from quantum physics to Haida storytelling. They learn that failure isn't a scarlet letter, but a signpost pointing toward deeper questions. Then there are grassroots learning collectives, pop-up salons in abandoned warehouses, online forums buzzing with peer-led seminars, flash mobs that debate Plato in public parks. Participants swap lecture halls for living rooms, trading dust-covered textbooks for open-ended conversation. Here, knowledge is co-created, not dispensed, and every voice wields equal authority. These rebels share a common thread. They turned Machiavelli's lessons back on power itself. They recognized that if authority thrives on obedience, true power lies in choice. They flipped the dynamic, no longer subjects of instruction, but sovereigns of their own minds. Their stories aren't mere historical footnotes. They're living examples. Consider the coder who taught herself algorithms on YouTube, then built an app to help rural farmers predict crops. Or the prison literacy volunteer who, through shared readings of Orwell and Angelo, sparked a movement for educational reform behind bars. Each act of rebellion reverberates. Knowledge liberated one person, then overtook an institution. What unites these narratives is not an audacious curriculum, but an audacious belief that every mind matters and every question counts. They didn't wait for permission to learn. They carved classrooms from curiosity, conflicts, and community. As you listen, ask yourself, where could you dismantle a wall in your own education? What untaught lesson do you need to uncover? The architects of control may shape walls and schedules, but they cannot dictate your desire to know. In the next and final part of our journey, we'll weave these threads into a call to action, a curriculum of liberation that begins the moment you refuse to remain a student.